Okay, ready?
Yep.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm here with Jill Purce in her amazing study shamanic environment with just about anything you could think of from all over the world in Hampstead, in London. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time out to be with us today. We know your time is very valuable. Jill is the leading authority, possibly, dare I say, on the healing voice. It's her work, has been your work for many decades now. And resonant ancestral family healing, as well as the Mandala work. So first of all, we'd love to hear from you, Jill, about your latest work and how that's going and some of the results and experiences people are having working with you.
Well, my work is really divided into three parts. The work that I've been doing for the longest is what I call the healing voice, which is getting people together in groups to do contemplative meditative chant, and in particular chant from Central Asia. This is a form of chanting that I started with when I realized that we had gone silent. So the more sophisticated our society becomes, the more silent we become or have become. And all the ways that we originally chanted or sang together have been eroded from our life through the gradual domination of science as a way of predicting what's going to happen in the future. So as living beings, the thing that most motivates us is remaining living. And traditionally people remain living by chanting, by praising God, because in traditional cultures there was always something much larger than the human being who was seen as being in charge of the whole operation. And so the way that people guaranteed their continued existence was by praising the boss, if you like. And so by praising, saying how great, how good, how blue, how green, and then please help me, please help my family, please bring the rain, please may my children pass their exams, and so forth. And then on a more sophisticated level, participation, so a more meditative, contemplative type of meditative chant. So these ways have been conducted since time began. And this was always the way right up until, right up really until the 17th century when science began to take over, when measuring and counting took over, and people thought they could predict tomorrow based on what happened yesterday through grinding it up, counting, measuring it, and so forth. And then gradually, between then and now, the divine became redundant. So now the world is full of, the atheistic community is advancing apace, and but interestingly, the threshold of the atheist community is trying to somehow incorporate atheistic spirituality and meditation, thinking that you can take one without the other. So, so what I saw when I started this in the early 70s, and I saw that we had really become silent. As we no longer sang to our children, we no longer sang nursery rhymes, we no longer went to communal spiritual activities. Going to church declined in most traditions. So what I was looking for was ways of restoring chants, restoring ways of people coming together to reactivate and reclaim, a sort of reclamation program for people to reclaim their voices, and thus a kind of the healing aspects of chanting together in community, which are numerous. And so I tried to find ways of chanting which were which didn't mean you had to be a card-carrying Sufi or Christian or Muslim or whatever. Ways of chanting where, in a way, you could understand what the fundamental principles of chant were, and then use those as a group activity. And this is what I did for many years. And in the pursuit of that, the form of chanting that I found most extraordinary was a form of chanting from Central Asia, where you chant on a single note and you split the note so that you have a sort of drone, and then above it you have these high flute-like harmonics floating above the fundamental. Now this is very interesting for many reasons. One, it's in tune, and that might sound an unnecessary thing to say, but actually in the 17th century, because of the popularity of keyboard instruments, there was a big problem over the tuning system that was used, which was basically using the fifth, which is the note 5 notes above the note you start, and then the 5 notes above that, 5 notes above that. It's called a cycle of fifths. So this form of tuning didn't work with keyboard instruments, and so something else had to be discovered or recreated. So actually what happened was something called the tempered scale. This was a compromise, which meant that all the intervals within the octave were made a little bit out of tune, so that it sounded better than it had done before. And this means that all Western music since Bach, for example, is out of tune. So, people come to your house to tune your piano, they're out of tune, and this is not so well known. So this form of chanting that I discovered in 2 different ways. One, working with the chant master of the Gyuto monks, learning this very, very ancient, archaic form of chanting done by these communities. And the other way was I was living and working with a well-known German composer called Karlheinz Stockhausen in Germany from 71 to 74. And in 1968 he wrote a piece called Stimmung for 6 singers doing a form of vocal harmonics. And Stockhausen created electronic music, by sticking bits of tape together with sellotape and starting with sine waves, very, very basic reconstruction of sound from the very fundamental parameters of sound. So he had an extraordinary understanding of the very nature of sound itself. So I had the transmission from the one hand, the modern art, classical art, music tradition and lineage, and also from a very archaic Tibetan spiritual meditative tradition. So 2 very different inputs, and through that I was able to create a whole form of using the voice for re-enchanting. I felt that we were disenchanted. People say they're disenchanted with this and with that, with the other. So I take this very literally. If we're going to re-enchant, which I feel we have to, then that means to make magical through chanting. And so this form of chanting is literally re-enchanting. So it works in many ways. It works to dissolve the boundaries between people and therefore enable community, because community is always being created and sustained through chant. Because one of the things that sound does is, just as it creates boundaries and forms, and every form has their own sound, so it also dissolves boundaries and the separation between forms and also people, and also between the mind and body, and between the body and some other non-ordinary dimension. And so it's a very, very powerful way of allowing people to discover the power of sound, even though they didn't necessarily come with that in mind. So by allowing them to understand sound from a very fundamental point of view and discover the power of group chanting, they also find that it's an extraordinarily powerful spiritual activity, which enables them to go into very deep states of meditation and deep states of calm, intuition, and so forth, but also extraordinarily healing. So over the years, I've had very dramatic forms of healing come about through this work. So singing and chanting together are extraordinarily powerful activities, which we really need to reinstate into our communities, and that's what I've
Keep going.
So that's what I've been doing over the last 40 years since I pioneered this, and I pioneered it in the West, and I taught in Japan and India and various other, of course, in America and so forth. And now it's beginning, it's really taken off. When I started, there was nobody doing anything of this kind, and now it's become a huge movement, using sound as a healing modality. Of course, in traditional shamanic cultures, it was used, but in different ways. So that's one of the things that I have always done and are still doing, and am still doing. And then concurrently with that, in the last 20 years, is what I call healing the family and ancestors. So I've been working first with a kind of ancestral detective work to see how what our forebears did affects what we do, and that can be a kind of redemptive process where, even without knowing it, later generations find themselves doing things which redeem things that the earlier generations in their family have done, even though they did them for the best intentions. We can never know the implications of our actions. And this then developed into more specific work, working within the group individually with people for about an hour, where I work using something called family constellations with sound and chant and ceremony and so on. And this is based on the idea that when in earlier generations there's any kind of a trauma, and usually traumas involve early separations, untoward separations, so people dying early, committing suicide, killed in battle, in childbirth, divorces, separations, emigrations, incarcerations, mental illness, physical maiming, giving children up for adoption, being given up for adoption. You name it, we've all had this in our families, some form or other. But when this happens in our families, then what happens is that there's some kind of a stable form, a stable pattern of this trauma created, which goes down through the generations. And interestingly, now science has come to recognize this, and it's called epigenetics. So in the early 70s, I was working with Maurice Wilkins in the biophysics department of King's College, doing an integrative project on the spiral, taking it as a question of nature and the spiritual tradition and seeing where it led. And he, of course, was one of the 3 people to get the Nobel Prize for DNA. And at that point, everything was thought to be genetic, was thought to be in the DNA. But now, epigenetics is the buzzword. At that time, it was considered to be extremely unacceptable. And even though Darwin believed in it, and but so did Lysenko and people in the Soviet Union. So it was politically difficult and considered not to be the case. But now it's the buzzword in the life sciences, and it's discovered that the children and the grandchildren of people who were in famine, for example, like in Holland after the war or in the Holocaust, have got inherited trauma. And there's all kinds of different experiments done with the inheritance of fear in mice, in children and grandchildren mice, of ones who were exposed to a smell while getting an electric shock. And they find that even though the mice were bred in test tubes and had no connection with their children or grandchildren, nevertheless they inherited the fear associated with the smell. And so this inheritance of trauma is now accepted. And so what the work is about is having other people represent your family members. And by doing this, you get a kind of overview of the whole family in a timeless, generationless way, where you see the events in the family through the eyes of all members and throughout time. And when you bring back the dispossessed or the dodgy dealers or the exiled or the forgotten, then the effect on the living is extraordinary. And usually there is somebody in every generation who is following some earlier generational member who has had this kind of trauma. And so in every generation there is somebody who finds themselves following the earlier traumatized person out of the system and becoming exiled in some way, or outside the system, or becoming addicted or vulnerable in some way to something similar. And so this way the work involves restoring, doing a kind of restoration program where you're bringing back the exiled, acknowledging the forgotten, remembering the forgotten, and undoing that which was done in a way which, as I said, has an extraordinarily powerful effect on the living. And once you do this work, all sorts of wonderful things start happening to people left field. So people, when they do this work, they come back many times, because every time they do it, something rather wonderful happens to them. And so, and the work, the healing process gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and there's a kind of extraordinary restoration that happens in the lives of people who do it. So that is one other aspect of my work. And then the third main aspect is extended ceremonies, which have come to me through, they're not ceremonies that I've learned or inherited from others, but they're ones that have come through me, that are developed through many, many years of studying and working in different spiritual traditions. And the one I've studied in most is Tibetan Buddhism, where I've spent 40 years studying Dzogchen within Tibetan Buddhism. That's one of the three kind of paths. There's a path of renunciation, where you give up the outside world and try and go deeper into the interior world of spirit, meditation, and so forth. Or there's a world of transformation, where you gradually transform that which you think is inappropriate or unhelpful into something that you think is appropriate and helpful or better or kinder or more enlightened. And then there's the path of self-liberation, where you remember you've been enlightened all along, which is Dzogchen, which is, of course, the hardest. And most spiritual practices are within the path of transformation, where you take something that you think is unacceptable and try to change it till it's more acceptable. And so these kind of practices belong to that category. And so many years ago, I had this understanding about the nature of the mandala, which is a pattern of consciousness, particularly well known in Tibetan Buddhism. It exists in other traditions as well, in some forms of Hinduism and Jainism, but mainly it's in Tibetan Buddhism. And it's meant to be thought of as a diagram of consciousness. It's contemplated and so on. But actually, it's also, while being a diagram of consciousness, it's also a ground plan of the stupa. Because in Buddhism, before the Buddha, for the first 500 years of Buddhism, there were no statues of the Buddha. He is a Greek statue. If you look at him, he's wearing a toga, sandals, and curly hair. And he comes about when the Buddhists met the Greeks in Afghanistan and that general region. And then they started making statues of the Buddha, but it was very late. And before that, there were only stupas, which were demarcations of the center. They were also places of burying sanctified people or holy people or developed or enlightened people. And what people did when they came to stupas was they walked around them, they rotated, they circumambulated them as a kind of aspiration to the center. And so the mandala is a plan of this. It's also seen as the palace of a deity or an aspect of divinity with whom, if you identify, you take on the qualities of that particular aspect of divinity. And it's also a diagram of consciousness. It's also a diagram of the afflictive emotions, which when transformed become the corresponding wisdoms. And so what I did was I developed a week-long ceremony where we become the mandala and spend a week going through working with our afflictive emotions and transforming them into their corresponding wisdoms. And I do 2 a year. I've done 27 now, and each one has a different central aspect and theme. And they're very, very extraordinary. And again, like with the family work, many people do all of them. And so these really are the three aspects of my work. The first aspect of my work before any of these was working with a spiral. I wrote a book called The Mystic Spiral, which was taking the spiral as a question of the universe and seeing in what way it allows us to go from and through the different disciplines to be completely interdisciplinary and see how this rotatory principle is one completely fundamental in nature. You know, the spiral nature of galaxies, the flows of water, and almost everything. You can dynamic patterns of all kinds, and chaotic dynamics now, and many, many other aspects of the physical world. And a ground plan of the stupa. because in Buddhism, before the Buddha, for the first 500 years of Buddhism, there were no statues of the Buddha. He is a Greek statue. If you look at him, he's wearing a toga, sandals, and curly hair. And he comes about when the Buddhists met the Greeks in Afghanistan and that general region. And then they started making statues of the Buddha, but it was very late. And before that, there were only stupas, which were demarcations of the center. They were also places of burying sanctified people or holy people or developed or enlightened people. And what people did when they came to stupas was they walked around them, they rotated, they circumambulated them as a kind of aspiration to the center. And so the mandala is a plan of this. It's also seen as the palace of a deity or an aspect of divinity with whom, if you identify, you take on the qualities of that particular aspect of divinity. And it's also a diagram of consciousness. It's also a diagram of the afflictive emotions, which when transformed become the corresponding wisdoms. And so what I did was I developed a week-long ceremony where we become the mandala and spend a week going through working with our afflictive emotions and transforming them into their corresponding wisdoms. And I do 2 a year. I've done 27 now, and each one has a different central aspect and theme. And they're very, very extraordinary. And again, like with the family work, many people do all of them. And so these really are the three aspects of my work. The first aspect of my work before any of these was working with a spiral. I wrote a book called The Mystic Spiral, which was taking the spiral as a question of the universe and seeing in what way it allows us to go from and through the different disciplines to be completely interdisciplinary and see how this rotatory principle is one completely fundamental in nature. You know, the spiral nature of galaxies, the flows of water and almost everything. You can dynamic patterns of all kinds and chaotic dynamics now and many, many other aspects of the physical world. And many aspects of the physical world, but also this rotatory principle of the development of consciousness, where we both circumambulate, aspiring to the center, but also the development of consciousness in our own psyche. So these really are the different aspects of my work, all of which have, I think, are increasingly important in these increasingly in certain uncertain times, which, you know, in the last few weeks have got devastatingly more uncertain than they were a few weeks ago.
Very interesting. You made so many points that I'd like to go into more deeply. One of them, the first point that I remarked upon was when you say we've gone more and more into silence, which in some ways, of course, is true in that we're living behind computer screens often and more and more separation. But what chanting also does is take us more into the inner silence, that deep inner connection.
Yes, and here's the interesting thing is that sound, the gift of sound is silence, just as the gift of movement is stillness, which is why you put babies in cradles that rock and give them rattles to induce silence and stillness in them. So this is the very fundamental gift of sound, is that it enables you to go into the interior world of silence and to understand and to use it as a tool so that when you stop chanting, you're able to continue the presence inducted through the chanting. And so one of the reasons that we use chanting is because you can only chant in the present. So one of the themes of all spiritual traditions is how can we be in the present? So most of us are in a state of regret about what we forgot to do and the concomitant dreads of what we therefore have to do that we forgot to do yesterday. So we live in this ejection from the present. We live in this peninsula of time that we create through regrets and dreads and never touch into the present moment. And that is the only reality. And so all spiritual traditions have as their core how to be present, how to how to parachute into the now, which is here. It's not just the now, but it's here and now, as opposed to there and then. And so we live in the there and the then, and which is a timeline of anxiety, which makes us ill. So the question is, how do we become here and now? And the uh, the quality of using sound is particularly powerful, this, because you can only, as I said, chant in the present. And if at the same time of chanting in the present you listen to yourself chanting while you're chanting, then you're creating a circuit of attention which allows you to be, insofar as you're remembering to listen, in the present. And so the trick is remember to listen even when you've forgotten, which is tricky because you've forgotten, in order to remain present and use this as a tool for presence. And it's really one of the most powerful ones, because you're doing the thing you're attending to. So nowadays mindfulness is the sort of sanctified, the acceptable face, let's say, of the sanitized face of meditation, for particularly in America, where anything spiritual can not be talked about in many circles. So mindfulness is this acceptable face, this sanitized face of meditation, which takes as its core how to be present, and how to attend to that which is happening in the moment that it's happening, which is of course what it's all about. But if you're doing it with sound, you're actually making the thing, you're creating the thing, you're doing the thing you're attending to, which makes it much easier. And at the same time, you're also activating consciously all the resonant aspects of ourselves, because we are a resonant system. And one of the things about healing is to coordinate and coherify all our different rhythms of resonance. And to be healthy, you have to be resonant with the world outside of ourselves as well, not just to have the coherence within all the different resonant speeds of movement within us. So we're resonant beings. Even our walking is a resonant process, the oscillation of our legs, our breathing, our heartbeat, the rhythms of our proteins and molecules, and the breath, of course, which is the key and the one that's always used by becoming conscious of the breath. So all of these different rhythms are contained within the body, and so having a kind of coordination between them is really essential for the induction of health. And so when we're using sound, we're using it to both become present in the now, and at the same time to bring about a state of coherence in the rhythmicity and vibratory nature of our both physical and non-physical beings.
Thank you. And when you were talking about, of course, in the old days, sort of early times after Buddha, people didn't worship icons, and it was all about circling around the center, doing that connection walk. And of course, coming back to Christian mystics, which are more my field, Jesus always, Yeshua, said, do not worship icons. And this is a very interesting subject, because as I look around your room, we're surrounded by hundreds, if not thousands, of icons. Can you comment on that?
Yes. As I said, the image of the Buddha is very late, and of course Buddhism is always quoted as being not being a religion, and that the Buddha isn't considered a deity. But like all traditions, Buddhism was a thin layer on top of many earlier strata of different spiritual and shamanic forms of practice and understanding. And so the accretions over the years in different aspects of Buddhism have included aspects of divinities which have been personified in different ways. And so, the Dalai Lama, for example, will, and all of the well-known lamas and proponents of Tibetan Buddhism will, for example, do practices of the goddess Tara, for example, and as well as many other ones. So it's quite a complex question, really, this one of whether these images, these representations of states of qualities of being are what they actually mean, and is very, very, it's a very deep philosophical question.
Yes, because then we get into gods and goddesses and demigods and demigoddesses and the god without and the god within.
Indeed, indeed, yes.
And it's what the Native Americans call the great mystery or the unfathomable.
Yes, I mean whether and one of the what's called a hard problem in science is the problem of consciousness. Is what is consciousness? Is everything embedded in consciousness, or panpsychism is the latest buzzword? But this is an extension of materialism, where consciousness is in everything. But if you take that to its extreme, then everything is in consciousness, and so this is the hard problem right now,
The
and
paradox.
yes, and so whether you consider it as a deity, or whether deities, aspects of divinities and qualities, can be seen to have these common properties across different traditions, or whether you just see them as qualities without personification. It's a problem, and we're not going to solve it in this moment, I think.
So let's talk about the family constellation. One of the things I do is remote healing, and I often do group healing, and what I call galactic constellation, because of course our connections, our universal connections, are far greater than purely our ancestral connections. And what I'm wondering is, when you're working with groups, do you find that there's a resonant effect in people around the groups who are specifically working with you?
Yes, and actually, but also more literally with other family members. So very often people will come back the next day and say, "You're not going to believe this, but yesterday I was staying with my mother, and while we were working, all 7 of her brothers and sisters contacted her, and that's the first time they've been together in 25 years. This is the first time they've had any contact. So certainly in family members, this is dramatic." But these themes are not just individual families. So one of the earliest situations is kind of in the Western story. In the West, we live by the story of Abraham. God was a heathen was plucked out by God and told to abandon his family and go to the promised land, and which he would inherit. And he's diverted into Egypt, and having married his sister, and then tries to sell his sister wife as a concubine to the Pharaoh, and all sorts of nasty things start happening, and so they're banished. He tries to do it again, and she never has the child. She's already sort of 90 or 100 and still hasn't had her child, who will inherit the promised land. And so finally she tells Abraham to sleep with a serving girl, Hagar. And so Hagar, the Egyptian serving girl, gets pregnant, and Sarah, his sister wife, half-sister wife, is not, and is 90 or so. And so, and then is jealous when she sees the pregnant Hagar, and banishes her to the desert. And an angel appears to Hagar in the desert and says, "Go back, don't worry. You will have a child who will be a wild and a hairy man at war with his brothers." And so she goes back and has her child, Ishmael, the firstborn Abraham. And then 15 years later, finally, Sarah bears a child, Isaac. And as soon as Isaac is born, she tells Abraham to take Ishmael, her firstborn, although not by her own womb, but that was the tradition at the time. You could take a surrogate, out into the desert to die. And so Abraham reluctantly goes out into the desert, takes Ishmael and Hagar out, and leaves them in the desert with a skin of water and a pita bread. And in the place that he leaves them, a spring erupts, the Sam spring, and this becomes Mecca. This place becomes the center of Islam. Ishmael becomes the father of the Muslims and the Arabs and the Muslims, and Isaac becomes the father of the Jews and the Christians. And so the usurped eldest son becomes the father of the Arabs and the Muslims, and the second usurping son becomes the father of the Jews and the Christians, and they've been at war together for the last 4,000 years. So these kind of family patterns are not just individual families. They affect whole swathes of the world as we know it and their relationships. So what's happening now in the world is of this kind, and so these patterns can't be considered parochial. They're universal and have to be dealt with if we're going to survive the current situation.
That's right. And of course, the healing moves through lives, so goes into past lives, because ultimately what we're manifesting in this life is probably a result of patterns set in place in the collective consciousness or in past lives. But what I'm thinking is, if we, or if you're taking the family ancestral work into environments, for example, like Palestine or Syria, of course, not a large amount of the population can afford to come and do a week's workshop with you, or even are aware of this kind of work. But if you are working with even a smallish group in those countries, that is going to amplify some kind of resonant effect throughout the nation and the collective consciousness in that area.
Oh yes, definitely, and or with individuals of those from those cultures, even here. So the point is that we're working with a kind of field of consciousness, the field of the family and ancestors, field of the tribal family and ancestors, and whenever you work, it affects the whole field. So it's an extremely powerful way of working, even if everybody isn't able to do it, as you say. Those who can should. The more that do, the better, and the wider the effect it'll have. But it has a universal effect, without doubt.
We could do with a few of the world's politicians coming to work with you right now, or at least their families.
Indeed, indeed.
A few bankers, a few from the pharmaceutical industry.
Not to mention a few heads of state right now.
Yes, yes, that's right. So when I arrived here, we were having a very interesting conversation about war and Memorial Day, because, of course, the original concept of World Consciousness Day was to create a shift in the paradigm of celebrating war or remembering war into consciousness and awareness more of how we can live together as one world family. But you made a very valid point, which I think is fascinating and no one else has made, which is how important it is to remember the ancestors.
Yes, I mean, one of the things about the dead and the ancestors is they need to be remembered, which is why we say in the Christian service, we will remember you. And in the Remembrance Day, the key words are, we will remember you. Which is also to bring back the dismembered parts, of course. But so remembering the dead is something that we know the dead, and so one of the things about this work is that once people are dead, we think, oh well, we suffer because we are without them. But what we don't think of is that they've kind of graduated and become ancestors. And in all traditions, or in all pre-cultural, pre-literate traditions, and in ancient China, for example, still in present China, and in Japan, in the Far East, the ancestors are considered to be a powerful part of the ongoing health and prosperity and well-being of the living. So still you have Ancestor Day in April, in China, Grave Cleaning Day, and so forth. And this is coming back even more strongly now. And so one of the things that we've forgotten in the West a little bit, and you can still in the Christian church go in and write the names of your ancestors down, and they'll be mentioned or chanted or remembered on what used to be called Samhain, which is the Festival of the Dead, which is All Souls and All Saints Day. All Saints is for the sanctified dead, and then All Souls is for all of us. And so that still exists, and it's sort of coming back. And I do a Requiem Mass during my one of my week intensive, which I have over this period. And so the ancestors are very interesting because they themselves have no agency. They can't help us. They can just be irritating. They can be like clamorous children.
They certainly can.
Yes, just sort of putting their foot out to trip us up and be thoroughly annoying. But actually, they're just like children. They're trying to get our attention. And as soon as we acknowledge them, we open up the channels of transmission so that they can become helpful. And their role in life, or in their life, or wherever they are, is to help the living. And as soon as we acknowledge them, as soon as we remember them, which is what remembrance is about, they then can help the living, which is what they are about in all traditions. And so this is a very important part of my work, is honouring the ancestors, remembering the ancestors, And so the 11th of the 11th is, well, first of all, it's the day of Mars. So the 10th, I think it's the 10th of November is the day of Mars, as in Mardi, as in Tuesday also. And and it's the day of, it's St. Martin's Day, which is Mars's Day, which of course is the day of war. It is the god of war. But it's the day for remembering those who have sacrificed themselves for us on the field of battle. And I think this is very important. We have to acknowledge and remember the ancestors. So I think it's not just a question of transforming the quality of the nature of the day, but to actually make conscious the fact that we are remembering our ancestors. And that has a very important effect on the living, because the ancestors can then help the living remain living.
So one of the questions I have, which I've been contemplating as I've been working with people and their family ancestry as well as their past lives, and in my own family, is what happens in an era like this where we are evolving so fast and our consciousness is shifting radically all the time, and our ancestors maybe come from a completely different level of spiritual awareness or way of thinking. How can they help us?
Well, I really wonder about this. I mean, the medieval times was a deeply spiritual time, much more than now in many ways. For example, in the West, where there was a hermit in every cave, and rather like Tibet until the 50s. So I'm not entirely sure whether we are getting more spiritual, and certainly the political situation in the world is not improving. It's just getting more dangerous because we've got more powerful weapons at our disposal, and it's more global, and everybody's messing with everybody else's this and that. I'm not sure whether we are getting more spiritual. I'm really not entirely convinced by this.
Talk about sacred work and the ancestors. So when we are doing sacred work, does that help the ancestors move on in their journey?
Well, that's a difficult question, really, because one doesn't know in what way they exist or where they are or whether they have any location or how it relates to the afterlife process. One of the things I do in these mandalas, I have two which are focused on the subject of conscious dying, very much focused on the Tibetan practices of conscious dying. I've just done one. And so this, again, is a very, very important work. In some traditions, how you die is the most important thing. And to die consciously and is the aim. And if you're unable to die consciously through circumstances or being drugged or in pain, or then what happens to you after that, and how you work with your afflictive emotions as they appear after and enter into the wisdom and become enlightened in the journey. Again, different traditions have different versions, but all traditions have some idea about such a thing, whereas, of course, atheists would assume that there is nothing that continues. And if everything's inside the brain, of course, the brain decays, so that brings up the whole subject of the extended mind. Is the mind in the brain, or is it outside the brain? Or if the mind's in the brain, then the skull needs to be in the sky. So that's also problematic. So these questions are really unanswerable.
I'm sorry. It's very funny, isn't it?
So I think we really don't know the answer to this.
No. Well, I mean, Irvin Laszlo and Jude Currivan have, in their dialogues, have been talking about how science is now proving that consciousness exists, and Ibn Alexander too, in Proof of Heaven, how consciousness exists beyond the brain and beyond this body, and that science is very clear about that now, or becoming very clear about that.
Although it depends who you talk to.
Right, so there are still... Talk about sacred work and the ancestors. So when we are doing sacred work, does that help the ancestors move on in their journey?
Well, that's a difficult question, really, because one doesn't know in what way they exist or where they are or whether they have any location or how it relates to the afterlife process. One of the things I do in these mandalas, I have two which are focused on the subject of conscious dying, very much focused on the Tibetan practices of conscious dying. I've just done one. And so this, again, is a very, very important work. In some traditions, how you die is the most important thing. And to die consciously and is the aim. And if you're unable to die consciously through circumstances or being drugged or in pain, or then what happens to you after that, and how you work with your afflictive emotions as they appear after and enter into the wisdom and become enlightened in the journey. Again, different traditions have different versions, but all traditions have some idea about such a thing, whereas, of course, atheists would assume that there is nothing that continues. And if everything's inside the brain, of course, the brain decays, so that brings up the whole subject of the extended mind. Is the mind in the brain, or is it outside the brain? Or if the mind's in the brain, then the skull needs to be in the sky. So that's also problematic. So these questions are really unanswerable.
I'm sorry. It's very funny, isn't it?
So I think we really don't know the answer to this.
No. Well, I mean, Irvin Laszlo and Jude Currivan have, in their dialogues, have been talking about how science is now proving that consciousness exists, and Ibn Alexander too, in Proof of Heaven, how consciousness exists beyond the brain and beyond this body, and that science is very clear about that now, or becoming very clear about that.
Although it depends who you talk to.
Right, so there are still, still different fields of thought, because the Tibetans and the Egyptians wrote very large tomes about
Indeed
the journey of dying and beyond
yes.
the veils. So one of the things that happens in my life is my children ask me not to sing. And of course I love to sing, but chanting is very interesting, and they hear me chanting and groan. And I noticed in one of your interviews you were saying how we can all find that correct pitch.
Yes, I mean, the idea of singing in tune, I mean, I think everybody can sing in tune. It's really that the ingredients that are required are, one is listening, and the other is kind of showing off, really. You have to kind of let go, show off, but based on listening. And the thing is that if you've been told as a child that you stand at the back and pretend to sing, which many people have, or mouth it or something, then it's very difficult to do either of those things, because if you listen, you're told to stand at the back, and if you show off, then you're going to be told to stand at the back as well. So either way, it's not very helpful.
Be seen and not heard.
Exactly. So it's very damaging. People still tell children this. If children, a lot of children don't immediately sing in tune. It's something that children learn, that you can learn to sing in tune, and you can learn to have perfect pitch, at least to identify sounds when you hear them. It's harder. To make sounds, it's harder to identify them, but it's to make them and know what you're making. So these things are very learnable, and if you're told at an early age that what comes out of your mouth is unacceptable, then it makes it much, much harder. It compounds the problem. And Hildegard of Bingen thought that this was our soul. That they talked about the resonant nature of the soul, and I think our voices and our souls are deeply connected. And so I think it's very unacceptable to tell a child that their voice is unacceptable.
Yes.
And so that's a very radical situation that has to be tackled, and it still is the case that people say that. So don't be deterred by your children. Keep going, and yes, you can learn to sing in tune. And the kind of things that I'm doing, I have in my workshops a complete cross section from people who've been told, like to shut up or to stand at the back and mouth it, or whatever it is, and to very famous singers. I have very famous singers from all, all kinds of fields of music, including the great divas, famous classical singers, and because this particular form of chanting, the overtone chanting, isn't done by either, and it's equally fascinating. So it helps people who don't sing have a kind of courage to reclaim their voices, and people who do sing, it's utterly fascinating because you're making these very, very ethereal sounds, and also it enables you to be in tune, which, as I said, Western music is not. So it's very, very fascinating for people who in the whole spectrum, from people who say they can sing or who the world says can sing wonderfully, down to people who've been told that they can't. So these workshops are real levelers in that sense. They because normally never the twain shall meet. People who feel they can't sing will never make sounds in a situation with somebody who is a recognized singer. But in this situation it is, and that's wonderful. That's really wonderful.
One of the interesting things my guides have told me is that the big challenge or opportunity for women in this life, in this era, is to open our throat chakras, to use our voice and to express our soul and our sacred connection through the voice. And of course, the Dalai Lama has said that it's the Western woman who's going to change the world. So as I'm listening to you, it's striking me that opening our throat chakra and finding ways to use our voice as powerfully as we can is going to be fairly important.
Yes, I think it's essential that we reclaim our voices in every sense of the word. Well, women and men actually. Funnily enough, in terms of singing, young boys, it's rather unacceptable to sing. They're all a bit ashamed of singing. So it takes a while for them or to some pop role model for them to realize that singing is cool. For a long time, young boys thought it was not at all cool. But I think everybody has to reclaim their voices, whatever their gender preference or gender endowment or is. I think it's really, really important to do that.
Yes, it is important. I mean, the guidance was more that the challenge, if you like, for men is more around the heart chakra, and for women is the throat chakra, which makes sense, certainly if we look at the last 2,000 years of our patriarchy.
Yes, yes, indeed.
So, Jill, it's been fascinating talking to you today, and your website is jillpurce.com.
Or healingvoice.com
Or
is a kind of simpler
healingvoice.com.
way to get the spelling right.
Right.
Healingvoice.com. Yes.
And so people can find audios of yours there as well that they can chant with.
Yes. There's lots of interviews and audios, and there's some CDs that they can get, and a whole list of workshops. The best thing is to come to a workshop and learn to do it, and do it with other people. That's really the best. Jump in, join in, and
join in. And you're
have
doing
fun.
those internationally, so they can catch you in various corners of the globe.
Absolutely, yes, indeed. I teach, in England. I teach in North America, and I teach in Canada, and in upstate New York, or East Coast, West Coast, and in different places in Europe.
So your message for the world in these crucial changing times would be chant. Get enchanted.
Yes, re-enchant through chanting. Yes, and actually in my week intensives, people come from all over the world to do those here. So that's and there's a wonderful international community of people doing this. But my message is definitely re-enchant, and honor your ancestors.
Wonderful. Thank you.
You're
Aho
welcome.
to that.
You're very welcome.